In this episode, it's all about storytelling with Gordon MacLellan from the UK. This is TWiP. Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of This Week in Photo. I am your host, Frederick Van Johnson. Today on the podcast, I have the honor of sitting down with someone who might be a little bit different in terms of their creative powers than the normal folks that we have on the show, which are normally photographers. Today we have someone who weaves their creativity through the power of storytelling. Gordon MacLellan is a self-proclaimed storyteller, and from the off-camera conversations I've had with him, this man knows his way around a story or two, and I'm going to take some tips from him to, for bedtime stories and all that. He's got the magic. Gordon, welcome to This Week in Photo, man. How's it going?
Good evening. Well, good evening it is for me. Anyway, good evening,
Yeah.
Frederick. Lovely to see you again, and lovely to have a chat. So, yeah, it's going grand just now.
Yeah, this is good. This is really good. You and I, we first connected during Maxim Yago's creativity conference, which was just last week, this past week. And you and I just had kind of a one-on-one discussion there that lasted just a short time. And I wanted it to go longer because it was such a riveting conversation. You know, it was refreshing to talk to somebody who understands the art of story. And I'll preface this first question with, in the world of photography, we always talk about, it's all about story. Everything has to have a narrative thread through it, or, what story are you telling with your photograph? To have the opportunity to speak with somebody who understands story kind of intrinsically is a treat. So tell me about that. Let's start with your background a little. So who is Gordon MacLellan, and how did you get to the point where you are kind of a professional storyteller?
And this is where the storyteller suddenly runs out of things to say.
That's impossible.
It's one of those, it's really difficult to know where to start sort of conversations. Yeah. Right, let's do the formal bit. Technically, I'm a zoologist. So my background's science, and I trained then as a science teacher. But all my life, I've been a maker of things. I've made puppets and worked in puppet shows and puppet theatres since I was about 14. And earlier than that, I was always writing stories. So words have always been really important for me, and words presented actively rather than just on paper. Mm-hmm. And after 10 years of sort of sensible jobs, jobs that paid you once a month and gave you paid holidays and useful things like that, I'd reached a point when I was getting so many freelance bookings that I had to make a choice. And my decision was, I've got to go and do this. I've got to go and try this. And the deal that I made with myself was that as long as I had 3 months' work in front of me, I would keep doing the freelance work. I would go on being a storyteller, and that was I'm trying to count now, 27 years ago. So I've been a full-time storyteller and artist and maker of things and creator of celebrations since 1995.
Wow. That's great. I love that. So, I mean, obviously there's a ton to talk about. I feel like you and I could probably talk for 2 or 3 hours because I have so many questions. I love this, the idea of storytelling, because it's so underserved, I think, in a lot of ways these days. In the photography space, we have all the tools, right? We have these great cameras, lights, computers, software, drones, 360 cameras, all these things. But if you take a step back at them, these are just tools to tell stories for the most part. Maybe documentary, but they're tools to tell stories. And a lot of photographers aren't necessarily telling stories beyond the aesthetic. What kind of tips can you give them? Like photographers that are watching this, they're already competent. They know their way around a camera. They can make beautiful images, outstanding locations, but they want to start introducing the element of story into their art form. What are some ways for them to start thinking creatively?
Um, I think my immediate reaction as you were asking the question was not quite forget the aesthetic, but explore the emotion rather than the construction of the image. What's the emotion within it? Because it's emotion that carries the story. If I'm telling a story awkwardly, if for some reason the words I'm tripping up over my words, if the emotion is there, if the emotion has caught my audience, they'll go with it. Nothing matters because they'll be drawn into the heart of the story. So I'd say look for emotion, and also recognize that the story you're trying to tell will not be the one, almost should not be the one that people take away. Because
Explain.
people, people are very good at, or one of the things that really irritates me with some of my fellow storytellers is when they say, and this is a story about, which is fair enough, and it means that, or you should find out from that, or after this story you'll feel so much braver, stronger, fiercer, bolder, whatever. And I always think, no, my job is to tell the story that engages with this audience, but the meaning they take from it is their choice. I mean, I've chosen the story. I've chosen a nice, straightforward story, very silly story that I'll be telling this weekend about a fox and a rabbit, and it's about tricksters, and it's tricks one way or another all the way through the story. And at the end of the story, when we're talking about it, 30 children will all have different takes on the same story. For some of them, it was a funny story. For some, it was a nasty story. For some, that fox was really mean and he shouldn't have been allowed to do that. But that explains my rabbit. And so I could go home now and I can tell everyone that my rabbit was a hero in a story. And you think, it's absolutely right that I didn't set the emotional scene. I didn't say to them, this is what you will learn from this story. I deliver the image like a photographer does. And the story that they take, or the meaning that they take, is theirs. And
That's interesting. So it's almost subjective, right? It's almost like in the world of photography, to draw an analog over to photography. It sounds like you're talking about, and it's not exactly one-to-one, but the raw file in photography is the sort of the raw data. When you click the shutter, that gets recorded to the memory card that represents what that camera saw. This is pre-developing. So when you look at the back of your camera or your phone after you take a photo, the computer has already interpreted that data into something that our primitive eyes can visualize. It takes all those zeros and ones and makes a photo. And it sounds like you're supplying your idea is to supply that sort of narrative raw file that then people will interpret in different ways. Is that fair?
Yes, yeah. And it means that if we ask people to draw a picture that captured that story for them, we'd get lots of different ones, and we'd get all these different emphases within the story, within the pictures, that were the bits of the story that mattered to different people. And I mean, that's fine for me because my relationship with the group will last the length of a story. So it might be 5, 10, 50 minutes. Sometimes you get 40-minute ones, and even longer. The experience with the photographs different again. Because my words keep changing. My words build and play with emotions and dynamic. And as photographers, you're presuming it's a still image. You've got that, and you're hoping that an audience will look at it, will almost step into it and walk through it as a story. Challenge might be, if you had the chance, to ask them what should happen next, or what did happen next, and just see where they took the story that's contained or that started within a picture. where
Yeah,
it
I
goes from.
wonder, have you and that's a really good point, because if you're telling stories live in front of a group
Mm,
of people of varying sizes, I imagine,
yeah.
when you're doing live things, whether you're doing public speaking
Mm,
or whatever, performing, you have that energy that you can feed off from the
yeah.
audience, and you can adjust. Like if I'm giving a speech or a talk or something, I can watch the audience and I can know when they're getting bored or when I've said something that struck a chord,
Yeah.
and I can follow
Uh-huh.
that. Versus when you send a photograph into the wild, you have no idea. But
Yeah.
when you're weaving your stories, you have that benefit, right? So you can look and say,
Yeah.
"Oh, yeah, well, I'm going to tell this particular story." And you can consider the variables, okay, the age
Mm,
range of the audience, so that
mm,
can
mhm.
affect the vernacular or the type of words that you choose to use, your pacing, your tone, and all that. Is that kind of how it goes? Like if you tell the
Yeah.
same story to three different groups, kids, middle-aged adults, and elderly adults, it's going to change
Yeah.
depending on
Yeah.
the group you're speaking to. Correct?
Yes. Oh, completely. And it changes. It can be the same age group, and it will change every time I tell it,
Oh,
because it
wow.
is the whole thing. As you just said, the whole thing is a relationship between me as a performer and the people I'm working with, um, and that's a benefit for me, because it means I have got, again, as you've just said, I've got that immediate reaction. I've got that relationship to draw upon. It's also a risk because you suddenly get, oh, this was the wrong story to have told. And,
Yeah.
and I was going to say, that happens with adult groups. It doesn't usually happen with children, probably because perhaps I'm more comfortable with children. But every
Yeah.
so often with an adult group, you suddenly get to a point and you think, I really can't say the next sentence to this
You
group.
know why that
They're,
is? That's because that whole funny bone or creativity bone in a lot of adults has atrophied and is no longer.
yeah.
It's no
Oh,
longer.
completely. Yeah. Or it's not even the funny bone. It's you're not going to say something. Oh, that's a
Yeah.
bit rude. Yeah, and you thought,
How
and I haven't
dare
even
you?
got to the yes, yes, and I thought I haven't even got to the rude bit yet, and I've already offended half the audience. But I mean that's a benefit for photographers. So hopefully, if you've done the thing that's going to offend them, you're not actually standing next to the image as
Yeah.
they look at it. And
Yeah.
yeah, you get to run away and hide.
Yeah.
But
And peek from behind the
yeah,
bushes and observe.
yeah.
A couple things I want to get your thoughts on, and we touched on this a little bit a while back when we first met, but the idea of the hero's journey, and
Mm, mhm,
that sort of construct or lattice work that
yeah,
they say most stories in history were in some way
yeah.
built on this idea of the hero's journey. Can you, for the folks that may not know what the hero's journey idea is, can you sort of explain that? And then, is it necessary? I mean, if we construct a story, does it have to follow that sort of that
Um,
sort of thinking?
I think it's one of those way, right? The hero's journey, or I mean, one of the other sort of rules that turn up in storytelling quite a bit is a statement that says, and I always get this wrong. There are only 6 stories in all the world, and any story will fit into this model or this model or this model. And the hero's journey is really it's it's almost like a life story and going through moments of transition, rites of passage. It usually goes from young hero facing challenges,
Hmm.
learning skills, facing bigger challenges, getting rewards. Or they're models that I just find not at all useful as a storyteller, because I'm just like thinking, no, that might be fine if you're trying to analyze stories. My job is to have a relationship with lots of different stories and find a story that works for a situation, rather than worrying about whether it fits into someone else's analysis of stories.
Yeah.
I think stories are simpler than that. I think stories, yes, you can take lessons from stories, and people can take lessons or unexpected lessons from unexpected stories. And we're back to what I was saying before about don't presume that you know what people will learn or what people will take from a story. As a storyteller, my job is to tell a good story. And tell an effective story and let people take whatever lesson that they need from it rather than deciding in advance what their lesson should be. I once had a wonderful skirmish with another storyteller who'd been booked to tell body stories at a stag night. You know, do you have stag nights?
No,
it's right. Stag night is the night for the groom before he gets married. It's not. It's not usually.
Yeah, we have that. We have that. Yeah. We call that the bachelor's party. Yeah.
So it's he'd been booked to go and tell body stories at that, and he was looking at how he could tell stories that were about sort of respecting the wife to come, respecting the feminine, and we were left going, actually, what they want to hear are really rude stories, and traditional body stories aren't. They might not conform to modern standards of anything, but they're not necessarily disrespectful. And you need to look at them as their own experience and think, yes, is this actually disrespectful, or is it just outrageous? And are you just too offended as a storyteller to actually mention all the things that need mentioning? And,
the shock value, right?
Yes, but and also just our ancestors were much less inhibited than us a lot of the time. And
we get more and more inhibited over time. So I don't know, in 100 years, we're just, I don't know what's good.
we won't be able to talk about anything and do anything.
No, of course, or look at anything. I was going to say, in your opinion, what makes a good story? What makes a story good, and what makes a story bad?
And I think what answers both those questions often isn't necessarily the physical story, as it were. It's how I, as the storyteller, react to it. That I need to be able to believe in a story. Going back to children, they always ask, so is that true? Did that really happen? and I always say, well, there's 3 answers to that question. Yes, of course it did. Don't be ridiculous, of course it didn't. Or, well, it probably didn't, but it'd be quite nice if it did.
Yeah.
And almost everyone goes, oh, yes, the last one.
In one universe it did, right?
Yeah. But it means that, for me, that's the sign of an effective story, is that they had to check that did that really happen? And it's a good story if, for the time I am telling it, or it is absolutely true. That when I'm telling the story, I'm seeing it and I am living it, and what I'm telling to the audience, they're never an audience, they're always the people I'm sharing things with, is my experience of the story. So
do you see the story? Are you seeing the story unfold as a movie when you're?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Wow. I'm standing inside the story, and it means that if one of the things that you throw at trainee storytellers, which always freaks them out, is just say, "But what's happening over there?" And if you're really inside the story, you can just turn around and say, "But." There was a whole bunch of birds up a tree watching what was going on. They told somebody else, and that's how I know the story. For me, stories work when I can believe in them, when they feel absolutely true. 5 minutes later, I might be thinking, what a ridiculous story. But quite often, most of the stories I tell are ridiculous. But I need to have that absolute belief in it for the time I'm telling it. And often, when that doesn't work, that's what makes a bad story. It's one that essentially I am reciting, almost as if I'm holding the book in my head, and I'm not living it. I've just memorized a set of words, and I'm telling you the words.
Oh, I love that. If you've watched any kind of movies these days, you've probably heard of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They build these giant so they can then, create stories within this construct of reality that they've put together. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what you thought about that. The whole idea of constructing a universe that has sort of, I forget the word I'm looking for. There's a word that describes what I want to say, but there's a universe. If you're creating a universe with a set of standards and physics and characters and all that, and then within that, you sort of harvest out different stories or vignettes from the different characters in there. Is that a good way to think about things? Like from a photographer standpoint, I think about it as, for a photographer, wouldn't it be cool if instead of just running around taking pictures of flowers and landscapes and all this, you even if it's only in your own head, you construct your own little reality and you're telling stories within your own little personal cinematic universe and creating that narrative. Would that make sense for creatives to do that?
Yes, I mean it's the 21st century equivalent of a mythology.
Yes.
If we just sort of stopped and looked, say, at Greek mythology or Norse mythology, we've got that same concept. We've got a world that's populated by super beings and us. And the stories unfold and they have their own values and their own systems and their own, well, as you just say, there's physics and special effects and things like that. And there we've got Zeus and his thunderbolt. And it's exactly the same thing. It's that experience of a world that is now, it will grow its own stories, and the stories almost start growing of themselves. Because if in the Marvel Cinematic Universe we start looking at Thor and he's doing this here and he's doing that there, and then all the sidelines start appearing. So who was that person? What happened to his really good friend that we saw in Thor #1? Who then disappeared? It's the stories are there, and it's the equivalent of a traditional mythology, but now delivered through our modern media. I would say.
I love that. Yeah, and it gives you a box to work in, I think. Because like in the Marvel world, I mean, I grew up with comic books, right, which is our mythology, right, and reading those and sort of being into that world and putting myself in the place of the characters. Like when I was a kid, I wanted to be Peter Parker, right? I wanted to be a Spider-Man. I felt like I identified with that nerd, right? So I wanted to be him.
Well, I'm going to jump in there because what I find really interesting is that working a lot with children, Spider-Man is still everyone's big brother.
Yeah.
You'll get, if you get people dressed up as heroes, there'll be a few Iron Men, there'll be a few Thors. Now it's really nice to see Wonder Woman turning up. But the one that I think is most relatable to by younger people is Spider-Man.
Yeah.
And we're back inside the hero's journey stuff. Spider-Man is the young hero, and I think his importance in all of those arcs is a bit underestimated because the others are all very much superhero types, whereas Spider-Man's sort of, as you just said, he's a nerd, and he always feels a bit not quite sure about being a hero, and he gets it wrong, and he also just enjoys it. Just the whole web swinging down the street a bit, and you can just hear all these 8-year-olds just going, "Oh yes, I want to do that."
That was me.
Because it's about fun. It's not always about fighting monsters. It's about going, "Whoa, look, I can swing," and it's great.
Yeah. I mean, and it sticks with you, right? Because to this day, I'm no longer that kid collecting comic books, though the comic books have come to me from Marvel, thank you, and DC. But I could still hear, to this day, I can hear a John Williams Superman theme soundtrack or the theme to Spider-Man 1, and I'm right back there again, right?
Yeah.
I'm swinging between those buildings, in New York City and fighting crime and doing all that stuff. Yeah, it's amazing what stories do for us. Yeah, and it's amazing the powers that, the group that I speak to, photographers, it's amazing the superpowers, speaking of superpowers, that we have to create this stuff. I just feel like that missing bit of, to speak about a cinematic universe, the missing bit of unobtainium in the universe is the storytelling bit, and being able to weave a narrative around what you're doing to bring it all together. To wrap us up, what's a good way for photographers or any creative just to sort of start thinking a little bit differently about their art form, to introduce some story into it? If they're listening to this and the interview's over, they're inspired, they want to go introduce story into their work. What should they do?
Maybe, I never know actually when people ask me questions like that. I think I'd say, if you've got an idea for a shot for the image you want to take, think back to a line I mentioned earlier. Think about if that is a moment from a story. It is a moment from a story. I'll come back to that in a moment. Is what should be the next image in the story, and take that one, and leave the one you were thinking of, and just take the unexpected one. If you've thought, right, this is it, that's the shot I really want, and then think, okay, what should happen next, and go and photograph that, and leave the one you've just carefully constructed behind. That was one thing, and I've now just completely forgotten the other thing I was going to say. Unexpected. Nope.
Well, it'll come back to you. It'll come back to you after we hang up, right?
Yes, it will, definitely.
One thing that's going to happen after this. This is a great interview. Thank you for doing this. But there's going to be the questions of, okay, I'm intrigued. You've whet my appetite. I want more Gordon MacLellan stories. Where do I go to hear or see these stories? Where do you point people at, or is it all live performances?
It's mostly live. I think I put it in the contacts. If not, I will send it with images at the end. I've got a YouTube channel. You can find, if you look for Creeping Toad on YouTube, you'll find me. And there it's more poems and story poems, so narrative poems rather than lots of traditional tales, mostly because I'm quite uncomfortable about being filmed. I find it quite off-putting. And for me, storytelling is an exchange between me and a group of people. So they're never really an audience. We're all in the same space, and we're all experiencing something together, and doing that sort of to camera, as it were.
Yeah, it's like a communal experience. Yeah, I would imagine. Yeah, like we say, like even if you're doing something live in a Zoom, for example, and telling a story, there's still that disconnect between you and the audience. You can look and maybe see a thumbnail, and you're never going to get that. You're never going to make full on eye contact with another human and see them nod their head that they're getting it. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you, Gordon, for doing this. Thanks for coming on. I'll put all the links and the all those bits in the show notes for this episode, so folks can go follow you and do all that stuff. Before we end this, any last words you want to throw out there for the audience?
I think all I'd say is go and find some old stories and read them. Just find a book of old stories and go and sit down under a tree somewhere and read yourself some traditional tales and see what ideas they give you.
I love that. I love that. Okay, I know I lied. I said that was going to be the last question, and that was good.
No, there's another one.
That one. There's one more.
Okay.
You probably get this a lot. Your desert island. So let's call it your desert island 2 or 3 stories throughout time? Not ones that it could not necessarily ones that you tell. It could be told by others or fables or whatever. Even movies. What's your favorite story or favorite couple of stories?
Oh dear. Oh, he does ask difficult questions.
Yeah, it's what I do, Gordon. Come on.
Right. I would have to take Lord of the Rings.
Okay. Yeah.
Tolkien as an absolute classic storyteller in a really traditional mode.
Yeah.
In films, well, the tricky bit with films is then I'd want to take The Hobbit, the film trilogy. I would definitely choose some of the Marvel Cinematic Universe films, but you don't pin me down because I'm not going to say which one.
I won't because there's a lot.
There's too many now. And actually, from books, I would either take a really good collection of Norse myths, because there's so much variety in there, or so we're now going to get really obscure. The Book of Invasions of Ireland, which is the oldest set of Celtic stories, and it's magnificent. It's just, and there's a really rich poetry built into this saga of gods and heroes, and then almost from a more philosophical point of view, a copy of the Tao Te Ching. Just because it's one of those books that says an awful lot with very few words,
which is an art form in and of itself.
Yes, there. Yeah. Just to actually just take a 4-line piece and that just sets you off thinking for long enough.
I love it. All right, Gordon, thank you so much for coming on. I promise this is the end now. Thank you. Thank you for coming on. I appreciate you. I will link to everything you give me, including photos, etc., in the show notes for this episode. So I encourage folks that are listening to this or watching this on YouTube, head over to thisweekinphoto.com. and you will find it. If you can't find it because you're listening to this at some point in the future, just search for Gordon MacLellan and you will find him on the website. All right, Gordon, we'll leave it right there. Thank you so much. And you have a good rest of your week and weekend.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It was really nice talking to you.
This is TWiP.